Simon Marsden, University of Stirling. The First Minister this morning mentioned that the use of electricity for heating is something that will be considered in the future. In the light of the presentations from the Scottish presenters in respect of planning and city perspectives, I'm curious that there's been an awful lot of focus upon electric vehicles, but when is domestic heating going to be replaced by electric provision, and new build is no longer going to install gas central heating as a norm? It seems to be the opportunity is there now to do just that, and with all of the discussion about needing to compensate car owners that have purchased diesel vehicles, for example, the same is inevitably going to be happening with respect to home heating if we don't get on board the electric provision for that soon.
Do you want to take it, John, to start off with?
Well, I'll start off, yes. The government's consulted on its climate change plan, and there'll be a finalised energy policy in the new year. So from a high-level policy point of view, we want to do all that we can across the whole range of issues to reduce our emissions. In terms of the planning system, we want to encourage best practice around things like district heating to ensure that the new development that we create is fit for purpose and that we reduce emissions wherever we possibly can do. I think it's important that we all do what we can to reduce our footprint, whether as individuals or as policymakers, and that we push to have practical demonstrations of the high aspirations that we have. I don't think there's a particularly quick fix, but it's important that all of us address all of the policy levers that we have going forward.
Another question?
Okay. I was just going to just say that I suppose in Orkney we're in the enviable position that we don't have mains gas. So we've been moving for quite a while now away from oil heating, which was the norm back through the 70s and 80s, and I think that virtually every new build now that's produced in Orkney uses at least air source heating or boreholes. There's generally there's a lot. I mean, EMEC will speak about this a bit more, but the take up for domestic scale micro generation is quite phenomenal where we are, and we've adopted the policies that are put through Scottish planning policy, where we include the need for heat networks through our local plan. We identify which settlements should include heat networks, and any new build of any kind of scale, if it's not connected to a heat network, it needs to have the capacity to be retrofitted later on. So the hooks are certainly there at national level, and we're seeing those flow through now in our local plans as we produce them.
I'd just like to add that in the development that I showed, that is actually connected to a district heating system. And again, our resource management policy, like Stuart, it identifies the areas that should be looking for district heat systems and how we can connect them. And in a city, it's not just the new build, it's how do we help to retrofit and how do we connect, how do we use some of the anchor loads that we've already got in some of the big developments and start to look at a circular system for that. So it's quite complicated. There are lots of different elements. It's not just the planning policy. It's lots of other policies that come into play that mean that these things can be delivered on the ground. But there's a lot of potential. And Glasgow's also just announced a research into geothermal and to the deep mine waters, and to be looking at how that can be starting to be used as well. So I think it's very clearly on the agenda to look at different ways of looking at heat, and looking at getting affordable heat to the right people at the right time.
Yeah. Am I not correct in thinking you already have geothermal heating in the east end of Glasgow, and have had for about 10, 12 years?
Yeah, we have. And I'm referring to the fact that there's a new research site that's just been opened and is just going to be there in the East End to actually look further. been lots of research in geothermal in Glasgow for years because of the legacy of the mines. So again, it's that thing about the industrial legacy coming into the future and the constant looking at new developments.
Got a question over there.
If Scotland wants to be an integral part of the Arctic Circle, should Scotland be looking at new links, ferry links, to its the other countries, our neighbours in that region, given that we don't seem to have any at the moment?
Who wants to take that one? Erik.
Well, I would expect that if you want to link into the rest of the Arctic, there needs to be some sort of trade patterns that are generating a need to do so. That's the normal way that such links are established, and there are already a number of links in the North Sea between the whole of UK and continental Europe, and I don't see why, if there's a good reason for trade flows to fly or to move in a specific direction, that those kind of trade flows could be absorbed by either container feeder routes in the northern part of Scotland. I mean, if you wanted to start establishing sort of permanent routes between point A and B, there would probably need to be trade flows of a certain substance before it would make economic sense.
Cliff, I can just add to that. In terms of spatial planning, we want to ensure that the country has appropriate infrastructure, and the National Planning Framework provides for a new harbour at Aberdeen. It highlights the need for improved freight facilities on the Forth. There are other opportunities, including at Scapa Flow, going forward. So it's important that we consider the infrastructure that we need to enhance the links that we already have.
I think I can take one final question. Lady down the front there.
I'm Maddie McLean, ITM Power, and I can't help but mention hydrogen. We're talking about addressing climate change with LNG ferries, which have the same GHG footprint as fossil fuels, as it is a fossil fuel, as the marine diesel, and we talk about electric infrastructure and electric cars. And I want to mention the fact that hydrogen, of course, can be a great balancer and assist in all of these situations. But what I specifically wanted to address is hydrogen as a marine fuel in the Arctic. I know that there's a movement to ban all fuel oil in the Arctic, but actually there's research that shows that distillates could actually be more dangerous to the marine environment because they don't freeze in those circumstances, so they could have a larger spread and a bigger impact. And so I'm wondering if people have considered the idea of hydrogen as being the marine fuel for protecting the Arctic, as there's so much potential for renewable energy in this sensitive environment. Thank you.
Domagoj, do you want to respond on that one, perhaps? It's already on.
Okay. Well, thank you for the question. I think it's an interesting question about heavy fuel oil use ban in the Arctic. And going from there, I think a lot of different people I've come across have said that this shouldn't be a first step, as you said, just towards going towards distillate fuels, but making this being part of a wider transition towards alternative fuel, low carbon alternatives in the future. Now, LNG is probably part of that solution, or was in the past, from the perspective, at least it taught us how to make an alternative, or how to fund an alternative and develop an alternative. But if we want to go all the way and cut down carbon emissions, we would have to go towards something like hydrogen, or a combination of biofuels, or a hybrid system as well. Now, different people seem to have different perspectives of how feasible it is to have hydrogen on short sea routes just because of the size of the vessels and of the engineering perspective. But I'm not an expert on that, so perhaps someone else can add to it. But I think actually funding for alternatives such as hydrogen in the Arctic could be a first step towards kind of directing them towards a wider market. And I'm talking about this from the perspective of actually LNG, which first started off in Norway in short sea shipping and then spread around through the Baltic Sea and North Sea areas. So by having this niche area where you can invest and develop a technology, you can actually spread it wider and develop the expertise necessary to actually go wider. And I think hydrogen is a good example that we could use the same route or the same blueprint to actually develop a research level within Scotland and within the Arctic of actually using the Arctic as an innovation bed to develop hydrogen as an alternative. So from an engineering perspective, how doable this is or whether it's feasible in the next 2 or 3 years or within the next 10 years, I cannot answer that part of the question just because I'm not an engineer from that perspective.
Thank you. What strikes me from this really interesting session is the enticing prospect of something like a spatial vision for the architect with multi-stakeholder partnerships at more local level to begin to deliver that. I think our speakers have done brilliantly because they were each asked to speak for just 8 minutes, and I think it's very clear that each of them has much greater knowledge than could be compressed, I would have thought, into 8 minutes, but they managed it. So I thank them as chair for keeping so much to time. And I think it's appropriate now for you as an audience to thank them all for their contributions for this, and then we go to lunch. So thank you very much.